Welcome to Redundancy Matters with me, June Hogan. I'm a qualified career coach and outplacement specialist, and I've got a background in HR. And I'm the founder of outplacement services provider Wildwood Coaching. This is the podcast where I help HR professionals and leaders managing redundancies to put people at the heart of the process. In today's episode, I'm joined by Victoria Dale, founder of Inclusion 365, a diversity and inclusion consultancy. Victoria brings deep expertise in diversity and inclusion, as well as personal experience of navigating redundancy. In this episode, we explore how employers can balance process with compassion and make it more inclusive, why equality impact assessments matter and how to use them, and the adjustments that can transform the redundancy experience for individuals. I really hope you enjoy listening to today's episode, and if you want to go deeper into managing redundancies, you'll find the link in the show notes to register for a free monthly lunch and learn session where my colleague and redundancy expert Robin and I explore different aspects of managing redundancies, and you'll also find lots of resources on my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk. Okay, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to today's episode of Redundancy Matters. I'm delighted to have my guest today, Victoria Dale. Victoria specialises in diversity and inclusion, so I'm delighted to have her come in to talk along about what redundancy means to her, why it matters, and how employers can ensure more inclusive decision-making during that process. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you, June. I'm delighted to be on here as a guest on your podcast.
Oh, no, I'm really excited to dive into this because it's an area that I think is so important. Clearly, it runs through every aspect of leadership and HR as well, particularly within redundancy. I know we're going to dig into some really interesting topics. I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the listeners.
Thank you, June. Yeah, so I'm Victoria, founder of Inclusion 365. We're a full-service diversity and inclusion consultancy helping employers across all different sectors, all different sizes, to transform the workplace cultures to thriving, safe and inclusive places to work. We protect businesses from unlawful harassment and discrimination costing them their talent, customers and reputation by really spotting the gaps in their people policies and practices through our inclusion health checks, equipping managers, leaders and employees to hold those difficult conversations to challenge inappropriate behaviour, and also to help them make more inclusive decisions, particularly at key stages of the employee journey. We know that when planning and managing redundancies, we need to ensure that our decisions are fair, inclusive and equal and transparent.
Fantastic. So that real connection there with it touches everything, doesn't it? In terms of the commercial aspects of a business, it touches the employees and their experience and how you lead and how you manage. And we're just diving into one little bit of all of that. Yeah, I love the sound of all of that. So I always ask guests why redundancy matters. So tell us, why does redundancy matter to you, Victoria?
Redundancy matters because, how you decide, who gets made redundant, the criteria that you use, how you go about supporting those individuals affected at risk of redundancy, how you consult. It needs to be done in a fair, inclusive and accessible way and doesn't unintentionally disadvantage or discriminate against particular what we call protected characteristics or groups under the Equality Act 2010. By doing so, it helps build trust amongst employees. And it is such a difficult personal issue that redundancy involves people going through a very tricky time. So it's really important to put the human and the compassion side into redundancy at every single stage and recognizing that not everyone has the same needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll dig into that a bit later in terms of the different groups and the different needs. And I know from your own experience that you've advised organisations around redundancy and making that inclusive, and you've also had your own experience on the other side of the table. And what would you say that those experiences have taught you about how to manage an inclusive redundancy process?
Yeah, so I think about the need to anticipate and consider what impact the process could have on different groups by looking at the evidence, but also about ensuring regular ongoing communication. I can quite openly share this. When I was pregnant with my son over 14 years ago, I found out that the organisation that I worked for was getting shut down by government, and the person in HR, I remember, Amanda, she was really, really good in terms of keeping me regularly involved, communicating what was happening and recognising it was an anxious time for everyone. But particularly as I was about to go on maternity leave, what were my rights, what was happening. And so she was very good in terms of keeping that communication but also keeping it not formal, not robotic, but very kind of informal, very personal, recognizing, checking in on when's baby due, how's it going, as well as explaining what the process involved and keeping them updated as to what options I had available. I ended up going through voluntary redundancy, but it was just the way in which it was done. It wasn't like just treating me like a number, it was treating me as an individual.
Yeah, so recognizing that the different dynamics and the different situation that you were in as somebody you mentioned earlier about have a protected characteristic, a protected group, and there'll be lots of other groups in those situations. And I also have experience of redundancy whilst on maternity leave. And I think it does teach you and helps you then when you're maybe on the other side of the table to think about what was it like for me when I was, because you're out of the business, aren't you? You're not connected with anything that's going on. And I felt quite isolated anyway because I hadn't been at work for so many months. And your work brain isn't really functioning at that time, is it?
Yeah, definitely. And I remember the organization at the time were really good in terms of they provided outplacement support for all employees. They held sessions in the office as well as you would go to the outplacement providers' offices. And I felt very welcome. It wasn't like, oh, you're about to go on maternity leave. Why do you need to do this? Kind of thing, which can happen in some organizations. But I felt that I wasn't treated any differently to others. Yeah, it was a positive experience and kind of shaped how I see things now.
Yeah, yeah. And so I know you have experience within the public sector and that you've got experience with equality impact assessments.
Yeah.
I was really interested in how those can apply, particularly in a redundancy situation, but also to any organisation. It doesn't just have to be a public sector. So do you just want to talk to us a bit about what an equality impact assessment is and how it could apply in this situation for people listening who are managing redundancies?
Yeah. So it's essentially like a risk assessment. It's a information gathering decision making tool that helps employers to assess and record the likely and actual impact a key decision like redundancies could have on different protected characteristics under the Equality Act 2010. And essentially what it does is challenge your assumptions that decision affect everyone the same way, when quite clearly it doesn't. It not just looks at the data, which particular groups might be impacted by the decision to be made redundant, but also looking at the criteria, the process itself involved, what the steps that we are taking to consult with people, how are we going about that? Is it going to be through some formal communication? Are we using different ways to engage people? Also, as well, just thinking about it challenges your assumptions in terms of people's needs. Yeah, so it really gets you to kind of look at things holistically rather than applying the kind of like things like criteria. Gets you to think about, could the criteria be based on things, for example, absence related to someone's disability or pregnancy or being on maternity leave? Could things like performance rating be related to something that arises from someone's disability? There's been various tribunals that have cases about where a disabled employee has been made redundant, but the decision upon which they've been made redundant is being based on something arising from a disability, so discrimination arising from disability. So employers need to be really careful with that and discount those things from the selection criteria. So equality impact assessments essentially helps you think logically as to what impact could that decision have on different groups and take steps to be able to reduce or mitigate it from happening, discriminating against certain protected characteristics.
It's really interesting there because lots of selection criteria, I think absence is one that maybe people tend to steer away from because it can be, as you say, potentially discriminatory. And unless you've got really robust records, it can be a difficult one to make sure that you aren't discriminating. But you mentioned there about performance, and that's really interesting because, again, lots of selection criteria will have performance ratings, or people will be assessed against a set of qualities or behaviours, for example, in an organisation. So that's really interesting when you describe there about certain things that can arise as a result of a disability, which means somebody falls short of some of those criteria.
Yeah, definitely. So there was a tribunal case in which this employee had dyslexia, and it meant that they might have made some typos, some errors in their emails. Their communication was quite rushed. That then affected their performance ratings. That then was taken into consideration in the selection criteria when it should have been discounted. So it's things that employers really need to be aware of when it comes down to what adjustments have been put in place, managers' understanding of that individual, how they can be supported, recognizing that they got dyslexia, there might be some typos and errors in their email. But yeah, that is very important because obviously discrimination arising from disability is unlawful under the Equality Act 2010.
Yeah, yeah. And lots of what we talk about with managing redundancies does go back to leadership and leaders understanding their teams, understanding and being close to individuals' needs and being aware of that as well. Because in a redundancy situation, you don't want it to be the first time that someone's ever had a conversation with you about those particular needs, for example, or when someone's ever had a conversation with you about your performance as well. This stuff shouldn't be a surprise in those meetings.
Yeah.
And you talked there about looking at the data, having that upfront view of, and clearly you don't know who's going to be made redundant in a redundancy process, but if you are looking at that information and you're looking at particular groups who might be more impacted than others, I guess sometimes some of this might be unavoidable. So you talked there about mitigation. So how can having conducted an equality impact assessment and kind of having that as evidence and having it all written down and documented, how can that help in the event of a tribunal claim, even if you weren't able to completely mitigate everything?
It provides evidence that supports how you went about making that decision. What were the kind of key things that you considered? What was the data that you looked at? What consultation you carried out perhaps as part of the equality impact assessments? If you have employee networks, how did you go about consulting with them to gather any concerns? And it's a very open and transparent way to show what information you looked at, how you assess the impact of the criteria on particular protected characteristics, and what mitigating measures you put in place to try and reduce, not necessarily eliminate, the potential adverse impact. It shows you've taken all the necessary steps, including perhaps there was a gap in the process where you weren't checking on people's reasonable adjustments. So you put mitigating measures in place to ensure that employees with a disability were communicated. These are kind of reasonable adjustments that we can provide for you. For example, a note taker, an interpreter in the consultation meeting, just to ensure that you've considered all areas, you've put in place the measures to really support individuals, even if the decision at the end of the day is that person will be made redundant.
And I guess a lot of this relies on having a robust HR information system where you've got access to that information, because you're doing a desktop exercise in the initial stages before you announce. And then, as you say, there's opportunities along the way once it's been announced to then start, etc. So having access to accurate data is really important as well.
Yeah, it is really important. And I think I see often anecdotal evidence I've heard where employers found themselves in a tribunal. They've not carried out an equality impact assessment. And so they're having to quickly gather the evidence to demonstrate that they've considered all the options, that they've assessed, weighed out the risks, etc. So I think I know for some employers, they might not have a complete picture of the workforce in terms of age, gender, disability. It can be quite tricky. So I think that's where carrying out a consultation, be it anonymized surveys, try and gather some data on the makeup of the workforce would be helpful in this case.
Yeah. And as you say, you can only go with the information that you've got. You don't want to be that person that's doing backpedaling, because that's not going to do anyone any favors, is it? So that notion of that equality impact assessment sounds like something that everyone should build into those initial planning stages of a redundancy process, but also then have as guidance during the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was looking at examples of equality impact assessments on restructuring to see how other organizations have been carrying them out recently. And it's quite interesting because in the impact assessment form, they'll refer to, we don't unlawfully discriminate or harass any individuals on the basis of their age, gender, etc. But that's just words on paper. It's how managers trained to be able to understand their roles and responsibilities. So there's some assumption that, we won't discriminate against anyone in this process, getting them to look at the evidence, challenge their assumptions. And what I should say as well is it shouldn't be done alone. It should involve different people in doing the assessment and challenging what is it saying, what's it telling us. So if you've got trade union representatives, can I get them involved?
Yeah. And so that approach sounds like something, as you say, that is there to basically ensure an inclusive process. And so having something written down on paper, as you say, that we don't unlawfully discriminate, and most companies have that now, don't they? But this is showing that actually when it comes down to implementing those principles, we do what we say we do.
And it's about being proactive and recognizing that every individual have different needs, and again, putting the human compassion into the process. It really matters, which is what I love about your consultancy, is that humans are compassion side around outplacement.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things that you mentioned there were ways in which, when the process is being set up and then being managed, is thinking about those reasonable adjustments that can be made. And you mentioned there, for example, like an interpreter in the meeting or a note taker. So what are some of the things that HR professionals listening to this episode can be thinking about, reasonable adjustments for colleagues who may be in those protected groups?
Yeah. So when it comes to things like consultation meetings, I'm thinking about where, when, and how they're run. It might not necessarily be accessible for people who've got childcare responsibilities. So trying to avoid things like school drop-off, pick-up, nursery drop-off, pick-up times, not leaving it too late in the day, thinking about the format. So it might be more preferable to have it online, particularly for those who might be on maternity, paternity, adoption leave, who might be working part-time. So offering those kind of formats will help to kind of make people feel that their voice matters, that they're being properly consulted and involved and informed about the process, what's happening, rather than feeling left out of the loop. Because we know when you go on maternity, parental leave, you feel a little bit left out what's going on. Having regular communication via email or phone calls, I think, really helps. And yeah, they mentioned providing a note taker, a support worker, British Sign Language interpreter in the meeting, offering any information in different formats, providing information in advance about what to expect, particularly, for example, colleagues with a neurodivergent condition, for example, dyslexia or autism, might need more time to process information, and also thinking about how you present that information, ensuring you're using plain English, accessible, easy to understand. Because I think, only from my experience, I think sometimes the way in which employees communicate what's happening can feel very formal. And I know they have to follow a process, but it's about recognizing that we want people to understand, to get it, and not feel, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And those principles, I think, are helpful for anyone when we talk about communication, because lots of people, certainly that come to work with me and the team, they've never been through redundancy before. So if you've never experienced it, whether you are neurodivergent or not, having something that is clear and the information is easily accessible, it's presented in plain English, as you say, because at the time when you hear those words, there's so much that's going on in people's minds. And a lot of the time, they just want to probably get out of the room. That was my experience when I heard the words. I just wanted to get out of the room. And I do find that from people that I've spoken to, and also when I was managing redundancies, people just go into shock and they're not really listening. So having that follow-up communication, having information that's accessible, as you say, either online or in an information pack, and having it so that people can really understand, what does this process mean and what even is redundancy? Most people will know what redundancy is in terms of you losing your job, but the process itself can be very complicated and vary organisation to organisation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's about explaining it in a way that people understand, providing frequently asked questions, perhaps on the internet, and having drop-in sessions for people to be able to kind of understand what is the process involved, so they can ask questions, they feel safe to raise concerns. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And those other adjustments that you made there, I'm guessing that there's an opportunity again for people who understand that team members who might have additional needs, is to be checking with them up front, as you say. So letting them know, we're going to have a consultation meeting next week. This is pretty much what's involved. Here's some information up front. What might you need in order for us to best support you in that meeting? So not being afraid to have those conversations before the formal process starts.
Yeah, absolutely. And saying it in a way that, rather than just say, please let us know if you've got any reasonable adjustments, like you kind of worded it, is just, how can we best support you so you can fully participate in this consultation meeting? So people feel that, okay, they acknowledge me, I can revise what my adjustments are, what my needs are. Yeah.
Yeah, because those formal meetings can be overwhelming for some people, and for other people, I guess they can be very daunting as well.
Yeah, and I think also, if it is in person, making sure that, for example, that it's fully accessible for someone who might have visual impairment or might be a wheelchair user. thinking about privacy as well, people might feel a bit anxious. A memory just popped in my head there about when I was going through the redundancy process. It was an open plan office, but they had these glass meeting rooms that didn't feel very confidential. So be mindful about where those meetings happen. It might particularly have the impact on perhaps an employee who prefers more kind of quiet space, might have a neurodivergent condition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember when I was on maternity leave, there was an office that was literally inside the front door of the building, which would have been perfect because if you've not come into the office for a while, or perhaps you've been on long-term sick, for example, and you're coming in for a meeting, you just want to get in and out as quickly as possible without anyone really seeing you.
Yeah.
And I had to walk through an open plan office to a room it was a private room. It wasn't like a goldfish bowl. But I hadn't been back in the office since I'd been on maternity. So everyone wanted to talk to me and I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just wanted to just get in there and get out again. And I don't think anyone did that intentionally. It wasn't something that anyone would have maybe thought about. But if you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of people in these different groups with different needs, and maybe that conversation beforehand about, we're going to invite you in for your consultation meeting. This is where it's going to be. Are you okay with that? What support do you need? I could have said, could we just have it in that one inside the front door, please? Because I think that'd just be easier for me. And I'm sure they could have just rearranged it.
Yeah.
So and I'm talking to other colleagues and talking to other people and other guests. Sometimes it's the minute detail that you need to go into as a HR professional to really ensure that the process is as inclusive as it can be. And thinking about meeting rooms, you might just think, we'll just book whatever's free, because I know in some organizations, literally meeting rooms are like gold dust.
Yeah.
So you just say, we'll book all those ones out and that's what we'll do. But if you don't know where room 21B is and you haven't realized it's in the middle of an open plan office with all glass windows and glass doors,
Yeah.
it might not be the best idea.
Yeah. And the other thing as well, if it is going to be in person, it's about providing information in advance, wayfinding, because the employer might have moved offices potentially. I don't know where meeting rooms are, particularly for employees with a neurodivergent condition, just everyone really, about how to get to that room, what to expect when you arrive at reception. The office might have gone through a big refurbishment, who knows? Yeah. Just making them as comfortable as possible.
And that's a good point there about, particularly for colleagues who've worked from home for a long time. For some, it could be many years. They might not have been into the office regularly. Then making people aware that this is where the meeting's going to be. This is how you get there. Because it all helps with just calming down some of those nerves, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we've talked about those reasonable adjustments, and there's lots there on that list. One of the things, and this is hugely important, and again, other people that I've spoken to talk about the emphasis on making sure line managers feel prepared and equipped and able to have those sorts of meetings. So thinking about being inclusive with this process, what are some of the things that you would advise HR professionals to emphasize to line managers when they're training them and helping and coaching them to hold these meetings?
As you said, it's kind of very difficult, sort of sensitive process. It needs to be handled very carefully. So I think for managers, it's about being aware of their own biases and how that can influence how they might judge, interpret, or react to certain individual situation. They might feel more an affinity to someone who's being made redundant potentially or less, and how that can then affect how they might feel, how they might respond, make assumptions about how that person is. Also using active listening. Active listening is really important for managers to really get kind of sense of how that person feels in that meeting. So watching out for not just verbal cues, but non-verbal cues as well. It helps to create that safe space rather than just delivering the information, is recognizing actually, like I said before, it shouldn't be just about obviously reducing headcount. It's about actually how's that individual feeling going through this process. It might be the first time they're being made redundant. Active listening is about listening to understand, watching out for non-verbal cues. So a lot of our communication is non-verbal, about 90%. So really paying attention to the body language. Are they looking down? Are they crossing arms? Do they look worried, concerned, or perhaps, as you said, I think blanked out, hearing all this news, this information, and acknowledging how they're feeling. I recognize that this is a really tough process. How can I support you? Have you got any questions? And making sure that they look back in. It's not just about having one meeting, clearly. It's about showing them that you're there for them. If they've got any questions, to come to you to explain anything they're not too sure about. As you said, I think the process itself can be quite complex. So managers have a key role in terms of being able to break it down, speaking in a language that perhaps obviously with HR are very trained on how to kind of manage redundancies, need to be able to explain it in a way that is simple, clear, and accessible that everyone can understand. And as I said, also just signposting the individuals to any outplacement support, well-being, because we know that it can affect people's level of anxiety. You might be, for example, an older worker who might be looking to retire soon and perhaps not updated their CV in years or not being an interview. So yeah, just offering them reassurance.
What you said there about not making assumptions and maybe being aware of some of that unconscious bias. And one of the things that I always like to talk about is that you are listening to somebody, not through your lens of how you think they should or shouldn't be reacting or behaving, but you are empathizing with their situation, which means really connecting with what they're saying and not putting that filter on it, because how they feel is how they feel and how they're reacting is how they're reacting. And it's not about your judgment that you're placing on that. And that links in with what you said there, about the active listening to understand. I'm not just listening because I just need to wait till I get to the next question. We want to understand how this is impacting you, how you feel.
Yeah, exactly.
What's going on.
Exactly. And with bias, it's about managers recognizing their own biases, not making assumptions because someone is about to go on maternity leave. They might be less worried. Actually, it's very stressful. Yeah.
Yeah, being aware of that. And then, as you say, bringing that full circle in terms of this isn't the only time we'll ever talk about redundancy in this meeting, particularly, again, for people who might be on parental leave, feeling like, how can I ask questions because I'm physically not going to be here? And I had a client a few months ago, and they were asking me some questions about the process. And there's only so much that I can talk about because I'm not involved in the process necessarily. And I said, you raise that at the next meeting or go and talk to your sort of line manager. And they said, I can talk to them in between the meetings. And I said, yeah, just go and find them. And I thought, that wasn't something that was made clear to them. Maybe it was, maybe they'd forgotten. I don't know. But really making sure that it isn't just these 2 or 3 meetings. That's the only time you can talk to me about this kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think sometimes the process is laid out that it's going to involve these steps. This is a timeline. And then not actually really saying to people, you can talk between, those key meetings if you've got questions. Yeah. And managers following up on any concerns that employee might raise. Again, looking back in, keeping in touch.
Yeah, definitely. And then, as you said there about the signposting, so there will be some things, and if the organisation's offering outplacement support, then wonderful. And particularly, I think that flexibility for colleagues who might be on parental leave for whatever reason is giving them the opportunity wherever they might be in that leave to say, you don't have to start this today. If you don't want to go back to work because you want to finish what was your maternity leave and you don't want to start looking for a job for 6 months, then having that flexibility with whoever you partner with for outplacement, I think is hugely important. And then you said there's other signposts for other support that people might be wanting to access. Maybe that's the EAP if they've got one, or putting them in touch with other kind of charities that support mental health, etc. Because there's lots of things that could be going on in people's minds that maybe they don't want to talk to their line manager about.
Yeah, absolutely. They might have a partner who might be going through the same process as well, or might be off sick.
And so Citizens Advice and places like that. So it's hugely important. And if anyone's interested, I'll put the link in the show notes. I've got a list of organisations that are completely free that you can direct people to give them extra and additional support. So we've covered loads there, Victoria, about starting off with the process in terms of taking that holistic view of what could this potentially mean, to look at mitigation, to really understand the data, and to really understand the people that are impacted by this, and thinking about those adjustments that can be quite small but make a huge difference to the process. And then obviously talking about how line managers can support people in the best way. So if people are looking to bring a more inclusive approach to redundancy and maybe contemplating one of these equality impact assessments, tell us about where people can find you and how they can connect with you.
Sure. Yeah. So they can connect with me on LinkedIn, and also our website, inclusion365.co.uk, lists all the services that we offer.
Wonderful. And I'll put that in the show notes as well so people can reach out and get in touch. So I found that really interesting, just to really dive into all of that. So I hope that today's helped whoever's listening to think about more of that inclusive approach and think about how that process can be made accessible for anybody who's experiencing redundancy. So thank you so much, Victoria, for your time. I've really enjoyed today. And if people want to find out more, then all your details are in the show notes.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you everyone for listening. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to the Redundancy Matters podcast. I hope you found today's episode helpful. It would mean a lot to me if you would follow, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, as this helps it reach more people who are managing redundancies. Let me know what you thought, and if you have ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, June Hogan, and get in touch via my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk, where you'll also find more resources to help you manage redundancies. I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode of Redundancy Matters.